This is possibly, hopefully, going to be my last Rust for Linux video for the time being. We'll see how that actually goes. So there is a lot of context to understand what is actually happening here. Probably you've heard about the Rust for Linux drama by now. If not, basically there are some kernel maintainers which really don't like Rust and do not want it in the project, even though Linus did agree to bring it in. Some of those maintainers maintain very core systems and just didn't want to see the code merged. This led to some people leaving the kernel after some very, very heated arguments, and there was also a new Rust for Linux kernel policy released, basically explaining how Rust for Linux should be handled. Now, when I did the video on that, I didn't realize there was also an LKML thread about that policy. And that thread, it's absolute gold. If over the past week or so you've seen, oh, here's someone with a take about Rust for Linux, Greg said something, Linus said something, somebody else said something, there is a very, very high chance it was from this thread, because as you can see, you know, a lot of people had things to say. Obviously, I'm not going to read all of them. A lot of them just frankly don't matter. It's more technical arguments about, hey, this is what we should do with Rust, this is what we shouldn't do with Rust. And if you want to read the entire thing, I will leave it linked all down below. Instead, I'm going to focus on the ones that I think are interesting. This thread was first opened on February 9th, 2025. And as you can tell from the timestamps down here, no one even realized a thread was actually made. Not until over a week later do any of the comments actually start. I think this is when most people noticed it. I know that's around the time I was sent a link to it, and probably Phoronix got an article out around then as well, and people actually discovered that there was a discussion here about there being a policy. People probably found out there was a policy in the first place. Let's start right from the very start with Christoph Hellwig's reply. If you don't know who Christoph is, he was a maintainer of the DMA subsystem and basically is a very core character to why certain people left the kernel. I don't think having a web page in any form is useful. If you want it to be valid, it has to be in the kernel tree and widely agreed on. This, I think, is a totally valid point. I don't think there's no reason to have a web page, but if it's going to be kernel policy, it should be in the kernel. I think most people can agree upon that, but that would have opened up a whole nother argument trying to get that merged. But here's where we start the fun. It also states factually incorrect information, e.g., some subsystems may decide they do not want to have Rust code for the time being, typically for bandwidth reasons. This is fine and expected. While Linus in private said that he absolutely is going to merge Rust code over a maintainer's objection, he did so in private in case you are looking for a reference. Of course, anytime something is said without any sort of public reference to it, you know, you can say it's fake, you can say it's real, but nobody really actually knows. But this was reported on as a matter of fact by a bunch of outlets, so at least a lot of people seem to think it's true. So we'll have these bindings creep everywhere like a cancer, and are very quickly moving from a software project that allows for and strives for global changes that improve the overall project to increasing compartmentalization. This turns Linux into a project written in multiple languages with no clear guidelines what language is to be used for where. This, I think, is a valid concern, and this is up to the subsystems to decide what level of Rust do they want to have? Do they want to have Rust be very tightly integrated into the system? Do they want to have Rust bindings to allow additional things to be written on top of that? That is something for them to decide. And before someone mentions it, Christoph did not care about anyone having issue with the cancer comment. He's just gonna keep saying it. What I will say, though, about the Rust bindings is them being a good idea or not in the kernel is something where the ship already sailed a couple of years back. Rust for Linux was agreed by Linus to be allowed in the kernel. So yeah, it might not be a good idea, but that discussion has already been had. And if you want to open up another discussion to have that again and decide, okay, do we actually think Rust for Linux is a good idea? A dedicated discussion for that is probably the place to do so, rather than in threads where people are trying to get the code merged. I'd like to understand what the goal of this Rust experiment is. If we want to fix existing issues with memory safety, we need to do that for existing code and find ways to retrofit it. A lot of work went into that recently, and we need much more. But that also shows how core maintainers are put off by trivial things like checking for integer overflows or compiled forced synchronization. How are we going to bridge the gap between a part of the kernel that is not even accepting relatively easy rules for improving safety versus another one that enforces even stronger rules? And again, this is another really good argument. If this is the way that Christoph had originally framed the criticisms he had of Rust, I don't think there ever would have been the drama whatsoever. This would have opened up a good discussion that would have got a lot of people thinking about how do we do this, and I doubt anyone actually would have left the kernel. Yes, these things have been discussed before, but discussing them again is a bit different from, you know, starting a fight with everyone. So I don't think this policy document is very useful. Right now the rules are Linus can enforce whatever he wants, it's his project obviously, and I think he needs to spell out that including the expectations for contributors very clearly. For myself, I can and do deal with Rust itself fine. I'd love bringing the kernel into a more memory-safe world, but dealing with an uncontrolled multi-language codebase is a pretty sure way to get me to spend my spare time on something else. I've heard a few other folks mumble something similar, but not everyone is quite as outspoken. Now, I'm going to jump around the thread quite a lot because, as I said before, there are a lot of comments in here, so let's go to another one. Let's go to one from Keys Cook. This is a reply to Christoph's comment. Speaking to the what is the goal question, I think Greg talks about it a bit, but I see the goal as eliminating memory safety issues in new drivers and subsystems. The pattern we've seen in Linux with security flaws is that the majority appear in new code. Focusing on getting new code written in Rust puts a stop to these kinds of flaws, and it has an exponential impact. In other words, I don't see any reason to focus on replacing existing code. Doing so would actually carry a lot of risk, but writing new stuff in Rust is very effective. Old code is more stable and has fewer bugs already. Generally true? Yeah, I'll give you generally true. And yet, we're still going to continue the work of hardening C because we still need to shake those bugs out. But new code can be written in Rust and not have any of these classes of bugs at all from day one. The other driving force is speed of development, as most of the common bug sources just vanish, so the developer has to spend much less time debugging it. Ussi Lena discussed this a bit while writing the M1 GPU driver. You end up reducing the amount of possible bugs to worry about to a tiny number. So I think the goal is simply better code quality, which has two primary outputs: exponentially fewer security flaws and faster development speed. Now let's go over to that comment from Greg. This is one you've very likely seen floating around. There were a number of articles, I think Phoronix did one, even if you haven't read it, you may have come across the title. The majority of bugs, quantity, not quality/severity, we have are due to the stupid little corner cases in C that are totally gone in Rust. Things like simple overwrites of memory, not that Rust can catch all of these by far, error path changes, forgetting to check error values, and use after free mistakes. That's why I'm wanting to see Rust get into the kernel. These types of issues just go away, allowing developers and maintainers more time to focus on the real bugs that happen. Logic issues, race conditions, things like that. Things that a language cannot solve. Or, okay, technically a race condition can be solved, but logic issues, nothing can solve that. I'm all for moving our C codebase towards making these types of problems impossible to hit. The work that Keys and Gustavo and others are doing here is wonderful and totally needed. We have 30 million lines of C code, and that isn't going anywhere any year soon, probably any decade soon. But for new code, drivers, writing them in Rust, where these types of bugs just can't happen, or happen much less, is a win for all of us. Why wouldn't we do this? C++ isn't going to give us any of that any decade soon, and the C++ language committee issues seem to be pointing out that everyone better be abandoning that language as soon as possible if they wish to have any code base that can be maintained for any length of time. If you want something really fun, go back to the early 2000s, where people were trying to do the exact same thing they're doing with Rust today, with C++. Now, C++ today is not C++ in 2005, but a lot of the arguments being made are very similar. The difference is you get young Linus there, you get angry Linus, and wow, there are some fun comments. Rust also gives us the ability to define our in-kernel APIs in ways that makes them impossible to get wrong when using them. We have way too many difficult/tricky APIs that require too much maintainer review just to ensure that you got this right. That is a combination of both how our APIs evolved over the years, how many different things can use struct cdev in a safe way, and how C doesn't allow us to express APIs in a way that makes them easier/safer to use. Rust isn't a silver bullet that will solve all of our problems, but it sure will help in a huge number of places, so for new stuff going forward, why wouldn't we want that? One of the weirdest arguments I've seen against Rust is, oh, well, using Rust is just hiding your C skill issue. Why don't you just get better at writing C code and not make mistakes? And sure, yeah, you should get better at writing C code and make less mistakes. But at the same time, I don't think there's anything wrong with using a tool that makes it so certain issues are just not possible. I don't really see that as a solid argument. Yes, it's like a fun talking point to have, but I don't really give it much weight besides that. Yes, mixed language codebases are rough and hard to maintain, but we are kernel developers, damn it. We've been maintaining and strengthening Linux for longer than anyone ever thought was going to be possible. We've turned our development model into a well-oiled engineering marvel, creating something that no one else has ever been able to accomplish. Adding another language really shouldn't be a problem. We've handled much worse things in the past, and we shouldn't give up now on wanting to ensure that our project succeeds for the next 20 years. I don't know, I kind of want to give that like a inspiring speech reading, because that's the way it felt to me the first time I looked at it. Now let's jump back to another comment from Christoph. This is a reply to Miguel, who opened up this thread. The document claims no subsystem is forced to take Rust. That's proven to be wrong by Linus. And while you might not have known that when writing the document, you absolutely did when posting it to the list. That is a very dishonest way of communication. And regarding dropping Rust entirely from the kernel, well, it's up to Linus to decide, and he hides behind the experiment thing in public without giving much guidance, and then decides differently in private. Coupled with the misleading policy document, this doesn't even make it clear what contributors and maintainers are getting themselves into. This part here is going to become very relevant later on. And regarding all of the major contributors that were quoted in favor of Rust, I'm not sure how that matters. Of course your Rust testimonials are going to like it, otherwise you would not have quoted it. This is fair. Obviously, if you're looking for people that like Rust, you're going to include people that like Rust. Like, yeah, of course. They generally are not the people who do the grunt work to keep the core kernel alive. I wouldn't agree with that. A lot of the people that were quoted were kernel maintainers, kernel contributors, the people doing the work. They're not you, but they are very much very active kernel maintainers. And I absolutely do understand everyone who would rather spend their time on a higher level language with more safety, but that's not the point here. Now, it's by no means the only comment from him, but thankfully, thank God, Linus actually came in to lead the project. I've been talking about this from the very start. Linus had to put his foot down and say something. Are we doing Rust? Are we not doing Rust? How is this going to be handled? What are we doing going forward? I was hopeful, and I've tried to just see if this long thread results in anything constructive, but this seems to be going backwards, or at least not forwards. The fact is, the pull request you objected to did not touch the DMA layer at all. It was literally just another user of it in a completely separate subdirectory that didn't change the code you maintain in any way, shape, or form. I find it distressing that you are complaining about new users of your code and then keep bringing up these kinds of complete garbage arguments. Honestly, what you've been doing is basically saying, as a DMA maintainer, I control what the DMA code is used for, and that is not how any of this works. What's next? Saying that particular drivers can't do DMA because you don't like the device, and as a DMA maintainer, you control who can use the DMA code. That's literally exactly what you are trying to do with the Rust code. You are saying that you disagree with Rust, which is fine. Nobody has ever required you to write or read Rust. But then you take the stance to mean that the Rust code cannot even use or interface to code you maintain. So let me be very clear. If you, as a maintainer, feel that you control who or what can use your code, you are wrong. I am not looking for a yes man, and I like it when you call me out on my bullshit. I say stupid things at times. I know that feeling all too well. And there needs to be people who just stand up to me and tell me I'm full of shit. But now I'm calling you out on yours. So this email is not about some Rust policy. This email is about a much bigger issue. As a maintainer, you are in charge of your code. Sure, but you are not in charge of who uses the end result and how. You don't have to like Rust, you don't have to care about it. That's been made clear pretty much from the very beginning. Nobody is forced to suddenly have to learn a new language, and that people who want to work purely on the C side can very much continue to do so. So to get back to the very core of your statement, the document claims no subsystem is forced to take Rust. That is very much true. You are not forced to take any Rust code or care about any Rust code in the DMA code. You can ignore it. But ignore the Rust side automatically also means that you don't have any say on the Rust side. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, I want to have nothing to do with Rust, and then in the very next sentence say, and that means that the Rust code that I will ignore cannot use the C interfaces I maintain. When you change the C interfaces, the Rust people will have to deal with the fallout, and will have to fix the Rust bindings. That's kind of the promise here. There's that wall of protection around C developers that don't want to have to deal with Rust issues in the promise that they don't have to deal with Rust. But that wall of protection basically goes both ways. If you don't want to deal with the Rust code, you get no say on the Rust code. Put another way, the nobody is forced to deal with Rust does not imply everybody is allowed to veto any Rust code. And to my surprise, Christoph didn't reply again to this thread. This is the thread right here. I know the mailing list is very, very hard to decipher, but this is the thread we are on right now. Whether you agree or disagree with Linus's take, I am so very glad that he's actually had one, that he's actually come out and said something on the mailing list, not said something at some conference somewhere, not said something in private, but actually said how we are going to do this on the mailing list. So far, he'd kind of just sat back, hands up in the air, they will all sort it out, they can do it. Clearly, that's not what was going to happen, though. So I'm glad he finally decided to actually lead the project. Now, we did get a reply from Danilo Crumridge. When I added you to the original thread, it was exactly to get some clarification on this specific point. In my perception, a lot, if not all, of the subsequent discussions evolved around different aspects, while this specific one is not even limited to Rust in the kernel. Hence, I'm happy to see this clarified from your side. It was still a remaining concern from my side, regardless of whether the PR in question will make it or not. However, I also want to clarify that I think the maintainers do have a veto when it comes to how the API they maintain is used in the kernel. For instance, when an API is used for things that it is not designed for, which may hurt the kernel as a whole. I think that's a very different and very specific situation, and sort of becomes a wider discussion than just the maintainer themselves. Now, there's so much more to this thread, And a lot of it is just repeating the same points over and over again. If you have 5 hours to spare, as I said at the start, it will be linked in the description down below. But I want to go over to another thread. Patch V12, Rust Add DMA Coherent Allocator Abstraction. This title might sound very familiar, because this is V12 of the patch set that started the Rust for Linux drama that got people to leave the kernel. You know, the patch set that Christoph knacked, that Christoph didn't want in the kernel. This patch set was made a few days after that prior discussion we were looking at. This is very new, and I haven't seen as many people talking about this. Now, the thread itself is pretty tame. Most people don't really know about it. The only people here are Rust people actually, you know, talking about the Rust patches being made, and yeah, it's a productive discussion. However, a few hours after this was made, this one you may have seen. DMA mapping update maintainers. Christoph removed himself as a maintainer, and this was signed off by Linus. To be clear, he didn't remove himself as maintainer from the entirety of the kernel. If you search Christoph Hellwig, there is a bunch of other things that he is a maintainer on, and that is not going to change. The only thing he's removed himself from is DMA mapping. This is now being taken over by Marek. My best guess here is Christoph just doesn't agree with this decision that he can't veto Rust code that is making use of a C code, so he just backed out entirely from DMA mapping. And you know what? That's fair. If you don't agree with the direction, let someone else do it. That's fine. Now, it's unclear to me exactly what Marek's stance is on Rust. It's unclear to me because throughout this entire drama, I've not seen a single comment from Marek. So either he literally doesn't care about Rust at all, is unbothered by it, maybe likes it. I doubt likes it, because otherwise maybe he would have left a comment. It's more likely that it kind of just is there, and that's about the end of his relationship with it. Now, hopefully, this is gonna be the last time that I talk about Rust for Linux, at least for, you know, at least for a couple of months. Let's do a couple of months, let things progress, and then we can do some fun stuff again. Hopefully, we don't have more drama here. Hopefully. But what do you think? If you liked the video, let me know your thoughts down there as well. What do you think about this whole Rust stuff? If you're a kernel contributor, I would especially like to know your thoughts. So, if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to Play, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and is this the end?